Manager of Missoula Community Access Television. I'd like to invite you to another edition of What's Up Missoula. This program profiles civic organizations, nonprofit groups, and now media organizations in Missoula that are making a difference in the way we live our lives in town. Today we're going to visit with Sally Mauk. She's the news director for KUFM Radio, which is a member station of National Public Radio. Sally, thanks so much for coming over and your patience with the setting up. And I wanted to ask you questions. You're really my first guest in a series I would like to do on What's Up Missoula about news organizations in the Missoula area. So for people watching who don't know, KUFM Radio is based at the University of Montana. It's a member station of National Public Radio. There is a news show, and could you tell the audience how often it's on, when it's on? Oh, and the call letters. I didn't even think of that. And I'm going to write them down when you say them. I sort of know. But.
Right. Well, KUFM is, as you say, a member of National Public Radio, and on your dial it's 89.1 FM, and we are a public radio station located at the University of Montana. We're not a campus radio station per se, although the University of Montana holds our license. We are a public radio station that broadcasts to basically the western half of Montana. There are two public radio stations in Montana, one in Billings and one in Missoula, and we kind of, between us, have the state covered. And we do carry a lot of news. We carry national news programs that NPR produces in Washington, D.C., and those programs are Morning Edition and All Things Considered. And we carry Morning Edition from about 3 o'clock in the morning to about 8 o'clock in the morning with Montana news interspersed there. Right. We have local newscasts at 7, 7:30, and 8. It's really kind of 7:06, 8:06 because it's inserted into the national newscast. And then that's Monday through Friday. And then also Monday through Friday we have an evening Montana news program that is inserted into the national All Things Considered news program, which runs from 5 to 7:30. And 5:30 to 6 is Montana Evening Edition, which is a half hour of Montana news, local, state, and regional news, and ends with a national native news program about 5 to 6.
Right, that last 5 minutes. And people really think a lot of that, I think, too, because that's very difficult news to get a hold of, national native news. And it's produced, I think, in New Mexico, but it covers the whole United States.
There's actually two national native news programs, and the one we carry is produced in Alaska.
Okay.
Yeah.
That clear.
Right.
So I was going to ask you what the scope of the news territory was. So essentially it is the state of Montana, which is a very, very big area.
It is, and it's a challenge for us because our listening audience, even though we're based in Missoula and our staff is here, our listening audience includes Great Falls, Butte, Kalispell, Bitterroot Valley, Flathead Valley, and points in between. Yeah. And so that's a wide audience. We do have a Capitol reporter in Helena, Kirk Siegler, who covers state news for us and the legislature when it's in session, and then other state news as it occurs. So that helps in terms of appealing to our broader audience, but it also dictates that we do news that we hope will appeal to all of our listeners, that it's not so site-specific that other people outside of Missoula won't be interested in it.
Right.
But that is a challenge.
Because you can just focus and say, okay, we're in Missoula, this is our hometown, as it were. But if you were, you'd really be missing your mission if you said, oh, we're just going to do whatever happens right here in town, because your area of service is much bigger than that, and your commitment to those listeners is in those areas.
And I think also our news focus, as National Public Radio's news focus, is issue-oriented, and that appeals to a wider audience than, say, event-oriented news. We're not going to be the news station you want to go to if you hear a siren and you want to know where the siren's headed. We're not going to do that kind of news on the whole. But we will do news that looks at all kinds of issues, from political to social to educational issues, and look at the debates about that. And I think that appeals to a wide audience, whether you're in Missoula or Helena or Great Falls. Those are hopefully issues that our listeners are going to be interested in as well.
So the topics, so people might be curious about that. Now, I was going to ask you how much news is produced, so I don't know if you could say off the top of your head, okay, every week we're producing X number of minutes of state news or something. But can you say off the top of your head?
Well, we do produce a lot, actually, and we also subscribe to the Associated Press Wire, which all the news organizations in Montana and the country do, and when there are stories somewhere else that we haven't done that are of great importance, we will use the AP version of that story.
Sure.
But the vast majority of our news is produced by our news staff, and it's eclectic, and on a daily basis we'll have, I don't know, between 5 and 10 locally produced stories on our evening news. And just to give you an example, on our newscast tonight, we've got a story about a Harvard sociologist who's written a lot, is considered a national expert on urban poverty. And we also have a story on the proposed housing unit that the University of Montana is proposing near the campus, which seems like a local story, but really has a lot to do, I think, with the future of university funding, and that's applicable to a wider area. And then also in this same newscast, we have a Capitol report from our Capitol reporter, Kirk Siegler, who's doing a story on changing laws governing gambling on the Indian reservations. And then in the same newscast, we have a Bitterroot Valley reporter, Kevin Matthews, doing a story on a local sawmill in Florence. And those are the stories just for tonight.
Right.
And we do that kind of news on a daily basis. So it's very eclectic, and I think covers a fairly wide interest, hopefully, to people.
Would you, if someone said, okay, National Public Radio, that's news for the leftists, how would you defend yourself against such a charge?
Well, this is something that public radio has been labeled with for a very long time, and there are listeners who think we are very much leftists, we meaning National Public Radio in general, and listeners who think that we're totally sold out to the, quote, mainstream news and become a conservative mainstream news organization, or maybe not conservative, but definitely mainstream. And I think that the choice of topics that public radio does, which is probably more diverse than commercial broadcasting, certainly, if that means that it's leftist because it believes in a diversity of issues and topics and putting minority voices on the air, for example, if that's considered leftist, then the charge is accurate. I would argue
guilty.
it isn't. I would argue it's just the obligation that broadcasting should have to serve a wide variety of audience.
Right.
And we put conservative voices on the air as well as liberal voices. KUFM does, I guarantee you. And I don't think KUFM necessarily would fit that charge, and I'm not sure the national, I just think it puts on a diverse amount of programming, and that to some people that's considered leftist. But I don't think it has necessarily what would be called a leftist point of view, or a point of view at all, for that matter, other than putting on as much information as we can for people.
Right, and the only decision or tailoring process that would come into play there would then be the regional issues as you see them. Montana's a resource state. For instance, we take tonight's examples a little bit. Montana's a resource state, so it's pretty interesting about what's going on in a sawmill, because it's a resource state.
Exactly.
Montana's state legislature meets only every 2 years, so when they do, that's news, no matter what's going on.
Exactly.
In that regard. Oh, and you told me there was another story being covered besides Kurt and Helena and Mackey down the Bitterroot.
And then the university story, and then also the Harvard sociologist who's in town to lecture about urban poverty.
Right. Yeah, and as the cities of Montana are growing, or particularly even Missoula's been growing, and I know Bozeman and Billings, urban poverty might be a topic of interest because it's something kind of new that's happening as Montana's kind of growing more urban centers.
Absolutely, and I think I did the interview with the Harvard sociologist today, and a lot of what he was saying about the cycle of poverty in inner cities in the U.S., you could apply to Native American reservations in Montana as well. I think the lack of economic opportunity and the high dropout rate in schools and so on. There's definitely an overlay there.
Yeah. Well, I did want to ask you a little bit, too, about, you mentioned when you were defending KUFM in particular from that leftist charge, that there are conservative voices on KUFM, and I imagine that comes from the commentary that the station sponsors?
It comes from commentary and also who we choose to interview. I mean, certainly
Okay,
when we cover issues that have different points of view, we get all those points of view on the air. We don't just get one that has a particular slant. We definitely put the people on the air who are involved in the issue, no matter what their political stripe.
Oh, I see what you mean, 4 quotes. Yeah, because if you had a particular slant on something, the side you agreed with would get a soundbite. The side you didn't agree with would, oh, and so said this thing from there or something.
Right. I mean, obviously we try to practice absolutely good, fair, objective journalism. Yeah.
And I think that's a very good point you made about the diversity. You know, that sometimes diversity is seen as a leftist thing to do, as diversity itself is a leftist coined word or something. I know somewhat I was trying to think about why here at Missoula Community Access Television, people initially thought of it, because a lot of people that started MCAT were perceived as leftist or liberal-leaning people. And one thing I had thought of was that if the idea is communication, sometimes communication is a liberal idea, whereas holding your tongue is a conservative idea. There's certain things you don't
sense of
talk
the
about.
definition,
In that regard. So I don't know. But I was going to ask you too about the opportunity for the non-professional voices to appear on KUFM, to be heard, on KUFM, in the commentary that you have. Like, how are people selected? How is the commentary delivered to the listening audience?
Should probably tell a little bit about what the commentaries are. And basically the commentaries we air are like letters to the editor of the newspaper. They're not news stories, and they're not part of our newscast per se. They're at the end of, when the newscast is over, we air commentaries, and they're usually 3 to 5 minutes long, and we have at the moment, I think we have about 15 different commentators on a monthly basis. They're on every day, but they rotate it most of the time on a monthly basis. And they represent various points of view and constituencies, and they're chosen by the criteria that we want to have a wide geographical representation, so we don't want to just have Missoula commentators, but commentators from our outlying listening areas. And also that they have some constituency for their point of view that isn't just one person's ideas, but the ideas represent a wider group. And that they're politically all over the spectrum. So we have, for example, conservationists as commentators. We have people from the wood products industry as commentators. We have a veteran commentator. We have so many.
Right.
But really, they do run the gamut of points of view and constituencies. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to put that diversity again on the air. And it's a very popular thing that we broadcast. We get a lot of feedback on our commentaries because they're meant to have a point of view. They're meant to spark people to think about an issue from a different, maybe a point of view that the person doesn't have themselves. Yeah.
So it creates some dialogue.
Right.
And I wanted to make sure, I know we'll be running some character generation while we're talking, but sometimes I think people have a hard time seeing that. So I want to make sure that people know if they want to learn more about KUFM radio, they should go to the website, and the website is pretty simple. It stands for Montana Public Radio, but it is mtpr.org. And there, if people wanted, for instance, to participate as a commentator, to submit a point of view, they'll find that on the website.
They will.
Send us your comments.
They'll find my email address and they can contact me. And we do keep one slot open each month for a guest commentary. And if somebody hears something on KUFM and they want to talk about it or offer a different point of view, that's what that slot is for. And we'll definitely get them on the air.
And also, if people don't have access to the internet and they do want to comment about programming on KUFM or learn more about KUFM, there is a listener comment line. And that's real easy. It's 243, which is the university prefix for everything, and it is KUFM on your dial. And we didn't translate that for numbers, but it is 243 KUFM. And also, to tune into KUFM, it's on an FM wavelength at 89.1. And I think sometimes there's 2 in town, But that could just be a ghost, I guess.
There is a rattlesnake also
That's
that
maybe
you can
what
find
we
on the
get
dial,
here.
and that's 91 point something, and I'm sorry, they don't
I know.
remember what it is.
I don't either.
Yeah.
And
But if you do go to a different part of town, you do have to switch on the dial. But if you just go between 88 and 92 on your dial in Missoula, you'll find us.
yeah, and I'll remind people, well, they might not know that are watching, when we run the community message board here at MCAT, the audio underneath is that of KUFM.
Right.
So people can hear KUFM if they're wondering what that radio station was or what the programming was underneath at all times of the day at MCAT, because sometimes we'll pop into the pea green boat, or for the early morning it will be the morning news.
We should probably point out a little bit, Joel, the difference between MCAT, though, and public radio and public
Yeah,
TV.
you'd mentioned that,
Yeah.
and I'll let you start. And I'll chime in.
Well, I think what you do is true public access broadcasting, in that if anyone wants to be, it's my understanding, on your station, they can be. Whereas on our station, it's not that. It's not that, well, if somebody comes in the studio and wants to be on air, that we will put them on the air. We do have established programming that's produced on a daily basis, and so I think that's a big difference there. The access is not quite as automatic.
I think the impulse, is sort of the same. Like when you mentioned the criteria for people being heard as commentators, or like a letter to the editor, their letters being read, you mentioned that you want the diversity, just as much as many public access stations like MCAT want a diversity of voices, and we encourage that. And also that you don't have any particular point of view you want to foster yourself, but some of the limitations, because you have programming from national sources, because you have a commitment to a certain amount of professionalism that we actually, in quite truth, we don't really care about here. I mean, we do and we don't. We try to foster that in people making programming. Oh, gee, the audio could be better this way. And I've even been advocating trying to help people think more clearly about what they want to say is the most important thing. Because we could say, oh, use this great set, or why don't you have this better microphone? But if the thoughts themselves are confused that the people are conveying, well, maybe they need some help just in that clear thinking. But in any event, another thing you said too was, and I think that's very important, in your commentators or in those letters to the editors that are read as commentary, editorial, what have you, you're looking for representative, and I know that's a very tricky thing to decide, but you're looking for people that hold points of view that are representative. And so that may be different too. And I know also that the impulse, for people watching this program, they might be avid public access users or supporters. They shouldn't expect this is the same mission of KUFM. So hopefully after the show, there will be all these people banging on your door saying, let my voice be heard, Sally.
I'll refer them to Joel.
Yeah, they could always come down here.
Exactly.
Like that. But and also it sounds like, you wouldn't subject them to a really rigorous standard, but that you would want to have some of those criteria, that their point of view is something identifiable with a constituency or something, because the airtime is so precious there.
It is.
And the range that you're dealing with is hundreds of square miles.
Right. And potentially 300,000 people, so it's a big audience, yeah.
Yeah, it really is. Let's see what else I wanted to ask you. Oh, I know. And maybe we can close, because you have to go back to work. I haven't really been seeing if we did a half hour, but you'd mentioned maybe we should talk a little bit about the public's perception of the state of journalism in the world today. And there is, I guess, a lot of fighting. People saying, well, this station is all conservative, and this one's all liberal, or all the journalists are lying, or, they're in bed with the corporation, they're in bed with the government, or what have you. And with that as a prelude, maybe you would like to address, as a professional journalist, how you feel about the state of journalism today.
Well, I think it's more, my concern is how the public perceives journalism, because I think there has been, and this is talked about a lot within the profession, and rightly so, and that is that it's clear that the public distrusts journalists, if not downright dislikes journalists, and finds it a quote, sleazy profession, I think, in some cases. And I find that distressing, since I am a journalist, right. But also because I think it's harmful to the country if people do actually believe that. And I think speculating about why it is that way, you could say, well, it is just that journalism has gotten worse, maybe.
There have been scandals, recent
there have been
scandals
some
of people
terrible
saying, oh, I
scandals.
phoned in the story, or I made this thing up.
Right,
or,
with the New York Times. I mean, very prestigious organizations have had terrible scandals. I think it's also a big part of the explosion of media that looks like journalism but isn't. You know, there's tons of talk radio programs and talk television programs that on the surface seem to be news programs but are not. And I think the public, and those definitely are point of view programs, and I think the public, in the public's eye, it kind of gets all mushed together.
The infotainment, sometimes people refer to, where it's a blurry thing between entertainment, like a good debate, or people opposing points of view just verbally, just having it out, just socking one another in a kind of contest of will or embarrassment, humiliation, or force of personality that you might see at Firing Line and other shows like that.
Right. And those are not news programs, but I think if the public perceives that they are, then I can see why they have a low opinion of the profession, because it's not, on the whole, I think, necessarily informative programming. And I think that is probably part of it. So my other follow-up thought of what to do about that is to be more vocal, those of us who believe we are doing good journalism, to get out and talk to the public about what we do. And this program is a great way to do that.
Oh, good. I'm glad it's helping a little.
I hope it does. And I think that we in the profession need to be less sort of secretive about what we do, or not secretive at all, but to say these are our goals. And if you
shy might be a word, though, shy, because it's almost as if, I think anyone whose professional integrity is being attacked, well, I feel kind of shy about it,
or defensive,
yeah. Or if you're not supposed to have a point of view, if you're supposed to be completely level-headed, then you wouldn't want to make public appearances at places or go about explaining your points of view on political subjects or what have you. And I think it might make at least print journalists, radio journalists, people who aren't used to being seen by the public and don't want to become personalities, make the people shy.
Well, I think that's for sure a good point. I mean, I don't want to be a personality per se.
Right.
I love the anonymity of radio. And I also don't want to give my personal points of view about issues publicly. But I'm talking about what I do as a journalist. And I think that journalists should talk about that with their audiences and say, okay, do you think we're failing in this regard, or do you think we could do something different or better, and listen to the public about that and have that kind of exchange, and that would help, hopefully, raise the perception and also improve what we do, I hope. But I think it's a big concern, because I think if people don't trust the information they're getting, then they're not going to get that information, or they're not going to believe that it's useful to them. And that would be a very sad thing, I think, for our democracy.
Oh my gosh. I mean, people essentially stop taking the news seriously. There's always that didn't really happen, or that's not the way it really is, but I don't know what it is, because the delivery systems completely fail.
Right.
Yeah, that seems particularly creepy, indeed. Well, gosh, Sally, is there anything you want to add?
No, but just thanks again, Joel, for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
You're most welcome. Thank you for coming. And we'll like to interview more people in journalism in Missoula, and I'll let you know how that goes. You're my very first, and I appreciate that.
All right.
Well, I'd like to thank everyone for watching this edition of What's Up Missoula. Again, we've been visiting with Sally Mauk. She's the news director for KUFM Radio. You can find it on the FM wavelength at 89.1. If you want to go to the website, it is mtpr.org. You can learn more about it, and you can participate, too, giving listener feedback to local KUFM radio, which covers almost half the state of Montana. You've been watching an edition of What's Up Missoula. If you know of an organization you'd like to see on this show, give us a call at MCAT. The number is 542-6228. For MCAT, I'm Joel Baird. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.